Welcome to the Every Gym podcast. My name is Andy Brady, joined in studio by our very own legend of Parker County, Executive Pastor Keith Warren.
Wow.
Keith, how are you?
Wow, I'm good.
That's good.
I'm good.
I mean, you are
unexpected, but good.
You are a legend of Parker County.
Oh, goodness, thank you.
Today's episode is on generosity as a disciple. Welcome to the Every Gym podcast. Today, Keith and I are talking on generosity as a disciple. Keith, could you give us just like a brief overview of your position, how you came to start at Northside 20 years ago? 21 years ago?
22.
22. I'm learning math today. Just maybe just like a brief background and catch people up.
You bet, yeah. So in August of 2002, I came over and interviewed with a handful of guys that made up the staff of Northside at the time. The open position was youth pastor, and that's what I was doing in Springtown. And the Lord would lead the committee and the church to call me, and so we began serving here in September of 2002. And youth pastor, and enjoyed some great years in that role, but the church was growing during that time, and Van had hinted early on that he wanted help in leadership, and that was a path I was really interested in pursuing. And so, I look back on it and at what a gift it is to promote into a different realm of ministry within the same church.
Yeah.
And so I was elevated, my position changed, however you want to describe it, from youth pastor to executive pastor in January 2007.
Oh, wow.
And so I've been serving in that role now for 17 years, still learning every day a little bit more about what it means to be executive pastor. And now having navigated some leadership change and certainly all the staffing changes that have taken place in those last 17 years. And so, that's how I got to the role. And the role really is primarily behind the scenes role. I mean, I have a stage presence that we joke that I'm the minister of announcements, and it's hilarious when people come to me and say, "You do such a good job." I'm like, "It's 3 sentences, really. Yeah, it's not much."
If you read your bulletin, I wouldn't have one.
Exactly.
So thanks for not opening it.
And I didn't even necessarily write those 3 sentences. So, but yeah, behind the scenes, working with our committees, working with budgeting, working with kind of an HR side of things, certainly all the facilities and maintenance and all the crews that take care of everything that hopefully looks as good on Sunday morning when the average church member arrives as it did the previous Sunday morning, if not a little better. So
absolutely. Prior to youth ministry at Springtown, you had a previous career. What was that previous career in general?
I did. I went to, I graduated from college with a degree in business and marketing, and really landed at the time what was my dream job. I was working in a marketing department in a corporate office in Las Colinas.
Let's go.
Owned by a Ford Motor Company, so it was a Fortune 100 owner of the company, and just doing what I'd been trained to do. And the particular role was marketing analyst, so we were looking at campaigns, mail campaigns, and different strategies to raise money for the company.
Yeah,
make money for the company, not raise money for the company. But yeah, it was great. It was great in the sense of experience. It was great in the sense of I walked off the stage of graduation and into a full-time job that could have been a career, but it was not what God had called me to do.
Yeah,
and I knew that pretty quickly after I got started.
I got to hear kind of the story, if I'm not mistaken, it has to do with being on a search committee, just serving, not just serving, but you were serving as a faithful member of which church?
Yeah, Eagle Mountain Baptist, and was just through an unlikely set of circumstances. I was woefully underqualified to be teaching junior high students, but I was, which by definition put me on a search committee for youth pastor.
As it does in most churches.
and I say this carefully because the guy we hired became a friend and was a faithful minister of the gospel and did a great job with our kids. But I was really frustrated that there weren't more quality candidates, that there wasn't someone that just stood out as someone that I felt was that I felt was qualified to take over with those seventh grade kids that I was hanging out with. And I don't know, that just created a little bit of angst in me. And it was through that process that the Lord really spoke. I mean, I know without a doubt that he impressed upon me in that moment that the reason you feel this way is because you should be serving.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love hearing when people have either seasons or moments that they can distinctly discern as, hey, God placed his finger on a very specific thing in my life, and I have no choice but to obey.
Yeah.
Because to not obey hurts.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really points to God leading me through college, through a degree plan that didn't make sense in the rearview mirror, but made perfect sense to put me in a place where I was uncomfortable so that he could apply pressure in just the right way at just the right time.
Yeah.
And after that moment, the fun part of the story is the next Sunday in church, the bulletin had an insert in it for Southwestern Seminary. And so I quietly applied and got accepted to Southwestern without telling anyone.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible. My wife and I attended here before we came on staff. After we started visiting, before we joined, outside of announcements, the first time I remember seeing you on stage for any length of time was you pulling what might be an impossible feat of turning a multi-page spreadsheet into an actual sermon of spiritual value.
Finding God in the budget.
Yes, and it was, and I don't say that. I don't say that simply because you're one of my bosses. I don't say that just to gas you up because you're on the podcast. Like, it was one of those like, hey, how's he going to make this work? Yeah. And then at the end, it was like that was incredible.
Yeah. Thanks.
What would you say are in 20 plus years of ministry are some of the reasons that you've noticed generosity being an uncomfortable topic for ministers to talk about and perhaps for people to talk about?
Yeah, I think it gets to the heart of our discipleship in a way, because it costs us something.
Yeah,
we have to make a decision to be invested in a ministry or to be actively giving to the kingdom through our churches, and it's clear from Scripture that it's a priority. There's no question that even Jesus talked a lot about money specifically. And yet, because, I don't know if it's because we're Americans or because it's just a Western thing, we want to compartmentalize that a bit. And I guess just assume that everybody is participating. But statistics tell us, and we can do the math pretty quickly, even in our own community, and know that a good number of people are not participating. March of 2020, from March 2020 to December 2020, church attendance nationwide fell off on average 50% or more. Yeah. And giving nationwide remained within a single-digit percentage of above or below the previous year. So roughly 50% of people in churches were not supporting the ministry of those churches.
That's a pretty telling stat.
Yeah.
That the ones that stay, I was hearing it this way, we lost most people, but the ones that stayed were more committed than ever.
Yeah, that's a great It's a great description of
and I think it
what
does.
took place. Yeah.
Felt very Gideon's Army-ish with it.
Mm-hmm.
When you think of biblical generosity, then,
Yeah.
which is going to be what we're basing this off
Yep.
of, not check the box,
Right.
not feel good, but biblical generosity. What are some of the elements that you think of, just based on your individual walk with Christ, but also maybe some insights that come with the role that you have, getting to see this church's budget from the 40,000-foot view, but also you're involved in other ministries and those budgets as well. What do you think of when you think of biblical generosity?
Well, I think I start with motivation, right? That if we're talking about biblical generosity, then we're talking about the Holy Spirit moving on a person to give something, whether that's financially or that's their time. Sometimes it's expertise. Sometimes it's support or affirmation. But this idea of generosity that there's not in me an overwhelming scarcity mindset that if I give this away, then I have less.
Yeah.
And particularly in the financial sense of things, we can see that God honors our giving. And if we have a proper view of our own financial situation, we recognize that we're stewards of that anyway, that none of it's ours, that God has blessed us to make a living in some way, and that in response to that blessing, we share in that gift with a church. And so certainly I think that's an important motivation. We have seen some incredible stories. We did have an actual Widow's Mite event not too many years ago. We were entering in the end of the year, and we were behind budget by a lot, by more than $100,000. And a lady, widow, she came in and physically handed a $1,000 check to our pastor, and her prayer was, if 100 more people can do this, then we'll catch up. And knowing the person, knowing she's a person of humble means, $1,000 is a lot of money for anybody.
Yeah,
$1,000 was a lot of money for her, and we got to share that story. And the reality is, we finished the year more than $100,000 ahead of budget. So it's had a tremendous impact. So I do think it applies to all areas of life, though. We have people within the congregation that have expertise, and just an email today on a project that's dear to your heart.
Yeah.
a gentleman that knows about the project reached out to me and said, "Hey, if you haven't committed to a path, let's talk about this." And I really think that means that he's got some expertise and some wisdom and some ability maybe to help us move that project across the finish line. Probably, and my assumption would be for significantly less than if we were to choose another path. So I don't know if that answers the question or not.
No, it does. It's the first thing I hear is motivation.
Yeah.
The second thing I hear is that net's probably wider than just the check. That it's all elements of my life are for Christ and for His kingdom.
Yeah. Particularly true for the mature, really growing disciple. And I think this next statement will be part of our series, but that giving is a part of growing, because stewardship is part of discipleship. Amen. And when a person is a committed follower, then it really isn't just about the gift. They know the impact of the gift beyond landing in a check, beyond meeting budget, beyond the ancillary things connected to that. They see the kingdom impact of that of that gift. And I think you're right. I think it goes far beyond just checking the box of writing the check.
Absolutely. We You mentioned the widow's mite, and I mentioned this earlier. Was with a family this last weekend. The matriarch passed away, and just kind of in discussing some of the practical things that have to happen after a passing.
Mm-hmm.
Just hearing the number of things that they were faithfully contributing to throughout their life. Some seasons of life had less money but more time.
Yeah.
So they gave some money and a lot more time. As they got older, there was a little bit more money, a little bit more discretionary funds, but less time. So they're giving, but it was just so unique of, hey, they gave $13 a month to this organization. They gave $25 a month to this organization. And you get through and you've got a whole paper full of things that, hey, God's doing work here.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be a part of the work that God is doing in the way that I can be a part of it.
Yeah.
Which it just, that's something that's been resonating with me for the last few days.
And I think that's part of that motivation, right? That so if I'm contributing to the ministry of a church, then when a kid gets saved at camp, I share in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? It's not just something I'm witnessing from the stands as, oh, that was a really cool thing that happened. I'm part of that.
Yeah.
When I walk, if I'm giving to the building fund, helping to support this structure, this campus, when I walk through the door, when I sit in a seat, when I feel the air conditioning, all those things, all those things, it changes your perspective of it. It goes from where I go to church to being my church, right? It gives me a role, or it gives me a level of participation, I guess is how I would say it. And I think that goes to the motivation that's, don't do it because of that, but because I've given, because I've participated, I get to celebrate that.
Absolutely. That's good.
Yeah.
It seems like for probably the last, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 years, you see more of like a pop culture emphasis on philanthropy and not knocking that at all. Like, we're going to give to this charity or this charitable cause. Yep. I think that's awesome and incredible. But from your experience and what you know, is there a difference between a Christ-centered or a biblical generosity and maybe just the celebrity or even a marketplace mindset of philanthropy and charity?
Yeah, you bet. So when I worked in corporate world, we gave a lot of money away.
Yeah. And
the thing I think I noticed about that is when we speak of philanthropy, I think that the people that are giving the money away or whatever they're giving away, I think they probably see those resources as their own. Mm-hmm. That I'm giving something I own to an organization or a cause that is important to me, ultimately so that others can see that I've given to that. And I think Jesus spoke to receiving the praise of others, right? Yeah. That we have our reward. And as believers, we see the shallowness of that. Even if it's a 7 or 8 or 9 figure number, we see the shallowness of that because the motivation is all backwards. Whereas as believer, biblical generosity, I'm sharing something that I'm a steward of for a cause that is part of my life, that I'm part of.
Yeah.
And ideally, no one ever knows about it at all. I don't want any celebrity from it. So in a way, they're polar opposites.
Yeah.
And I think it's sad because I think that sometimes what makes the headlines and what we see distracts us or erodes a little bit maybe of our own sense of meaning within the biblical world of giving. But I'd much rather be part of an organization that's stewarding God's resources than
absolutely
trying to deal with someone else's billions.
That works.
Yeah.
Is there a a people group or a person or something that as you were maturing in your faith that began to teach you and help kind of get you started as an individual in generosity and stewardship becoming part of your discipleship?
Yeah, so the very first church I was ever a part of was Eagle Mountain Baptist in Azle, and they had the scoreboard on the wall. You remember the little scoreboard?
I do. I actually saw one this weekend in the former church.
I have one in my office. I haven't put it up yet, but I have one in my office, and it would show what the budget need was and how much money came in and how many were in Bible study and how many were in worship the previous week.
And this week's hymns.
Yes. Yep. The hymns are there too. And I asked the pastor one day, he and I had become friends he was new, wasn't new to the church, but he was new in the role of pastor. And he and I became friends. And I said, so, and this is literally the way the conversation went. I said, so where does the money come from?
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, the offering. And I said, well, where does the rest of the money come from? Because in my limited but budding business education, I was still in college then. I mean, I could do the math, right? The number on the board was not very much, and we had to pay his salary, and we had to pay utilities, and whatever else the church was responsible for. And I just had this sense that there had to be some other source of money because that was not enough. And I was honestly young but shocked to find that that's the only source. There's no government program. The denomination isn't sending a check based upon the size of your church. In fact, it's just the opposite. And
not drawing interest
exactly,
with mailbox money.
Yeah, exactly. And so it really opened my eyes to the reality that if the mission of the church is going to happen, it's the people that are part of the mission that are going to supply the funding for it to happen. Yeah. And that was really step one for me, which got me to a place where even as a working part-time and still going to school, I was able to begin participating in giving.
Yeah. Oh, especially the begin participating in giving. It's it was taught to me early on. If I can't give the $5 out of the 50 I received this week, I don't know that I'll be able to give the $1,000 when receiving 10 or whatever. Sure. But it was I was fortunate. My parents were very open with us about financial things growing up. But I kind of get that first 12-year-old job. I made $25 every time I mowed this house that was a block away. So I was using my dad's mower, my dad's gas out of my dad's gas can.
Sounds like an economics lesson happening.
It was. My parents were really good at recognizing opportunities to learn and sharing those. And so it was like, hey, you're using equipment. You're using resources, so we're going to contribute to those things. So that money came off the top. And then it was, but you're also making 25. Here's what the tithe is. It's 10%. You know how to calculate 10%. So we're going to give $250 out of every 25 you make to the church, no matter what. Yeah. And then if there's anything beyond that, then you're free to do that. But it was a very real lesson early on that kind of taught me of participating and giving off the increase. Yeah. But then as I got older, getting to learn that it's, as we were saying earlier, more than just the check. Yeah. Right. It's participating in the kingdom work. Yeah. How can someone begin to determine either when to start giving or what to start giving? They've started walking with Jesus, and perhaps they just didn't know. Kind of like you, right? Yeah. Hey, where's this come from? How does this happen? What's maybe a step to start to take in that direction of participating in generosity?
Yeah, that was my story specifically, and I think the reality is you're right. People don't know for the most part. It's not something we talk about often. We don't explain when we put a giving report in the budget in the bulletin what that what that means necessarily. There's an expectation that people just know,
Yeah.
either through experience with other churches or they've learned it and just internalized it somehow. I don't know that other than one very specific case, and maybe we can share that later, but one specific case of a person going from not giving at all to tithing in one step. In 20 years here, 22 years here, and 9 more elsewhere, so 30 years, one time in 30 years do I know for sure.
When you say tithe, what do you mean?
So tithe is the biblical principle of 10%. You mentioned it a second ago. There's a great old lesson that we don't teach anymore, the 80-10-10 rule, right?
Yeah.
That you tithe 10%, you save 10%, and you live on 80%. And working to teach my girls some of those principles now. It's feels dated because it does come from a 20th century version of Baptist life, but such wisdom in that to learn to live on 80% means you'll always have enough, right? Yeah. And so it's part of that blessing. But yeah, so tithe would be the 10%. So you throw that out there, and most people can quickly recall their adjusted gross income from the last time they turned in a tax form.
Especially those of us that filed it for an extension and just did it.
Yes, count me in that group as well.
Yeah.
And can quickly do the math and go, ouch, and feel physically sort of feel the sting that might be to them in a practical sort of sense. Of course, that doesn't allow for the Holy Spirit's work. That doesn't allow for how God is going to be involved in their lives and all those things related to that. But that's what I would see there as the tithe. So I think for most people, there's probably some sense of a need to give just from the fact that we talk about it every Sunday in terms of we're receiving an offering, and you either have to participate in that or walk by and not. So I think step one would be just to pray.
Yeah.
What God do you want me to do with this? Recognize it, God. We realize that we should be doing this and we're not.
Yeah.
Particularly if you're a couple, to do that as a couple, and then do whatever the Lord tells you to do. Yeah. And if that's to start small, then start small. And if the Lord tells you to write a check for 10%, then write a check for 10%. Do whatever God tells you to do. Yeah. And I think that's what we compartmentalize it, and we sort of take the spirituality out of giving by making it administrative or making it a financial decision or something that's private and personal and not related to our walk with Jesus. And I think when we can recognize that it is part of our discipleship, then we'll see it differently.
Yeah, that's good. You mentioned before just the spiritual value of giving to the kingdom, and I think it's a good thing on the whole. Our church has it set up where you can effectively, I forget the term, auto pay essentially. Yeah. Auto draft. Yeah. That's what I'm looking for. Yeah. Where I have been convicted, because we've had that, maybe 7-8 years as a congregation now?
Yeah, 2018 in a solid, secure, and safe way.
Yes, so the last 6 years. But in that last 6 years, there was a year, the calendar rolls over to the next year and looking at things for the year. And it's hey, we've adjusted as maybe income has adjusted, but we have not stopped and prayed, God, does the percent need to change this year in many years? Yeah. And it's so easy to become something we don't think about in either direction, either something I'm not participating in at all, or, hey, this day, this was my case. This day 3 years ago, God said this percent, and it's been static. And God may want it to stay static, right? But he also wants me to come before him with an open hand, like, this is your money that you gave us to use for your purposes. How do you want it? Yeah. So that's a good pray and ask, and turns out he will answer.
He will.
And not just because it's money, but because He's our Father.
And He loves us. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's we're going to end on this one for our first episode on generosity. And if you will, make sure that you subscribe to us so that in 2 weeks you can hear part 2. That's it for the Every Gym podcast.